Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last Tech Talks DC session of the summer semester. Now, typically, Tech Talks DC will feature one particular department within ORSI, the Office of Research, Innovation, Entrepreneurship Services. And I got that acronym right, I believe. But today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be fusing a discussion that brings both the AI Hub as well as the Center for Cybersecurity Innovation together. You've heard me say this before, innovation is not set in stone, it's set in jello. And in today's topic, we're going to be looking at how cybersecurity trainings are evolving and how AI can be used to deliver new models and new innovations when it comes to training the future workforce in cybersecurity. My guest today has been recently nominated, or rather acclaimed, as the chair of the AI Hub at Durham College. He is no stranger to all of our sessions. In fact, he was the first person to deliver the inaugural Tech Talks DC of my tenure back in November 2018, when he talked about the relationship between AI and special needs education. All of you know him very well, Tushar Singh, the CEO of Minute School, and I will not waste any time by jumping right into the discussion immediately. Tushar, you're in no need of an introduction, so let's jump right into the questions. Tushar, you often hear about a talent gap in cybersecurity in Canada, dare I say North America in general. But a quick search on LinkedIn, as an example, reveals quite a lot of open positions. What's your position on what do we mean when we say there's a talent gap in cybersecurity facing our country? Tushar?
Well, you're starting off with the difficult questions right away, Ali, and I do appreciate that. And thanks for having me here again. So in my conversations with delivering training through Minute School and our various platforms, and of course our interactions with DC, I get to interact with many companies, leaders of many companies, those in cybersecurity, those in large companies, medium companies, small as well. And there is a significant gap that they are finding when they need to hire, that they need to fulfill their overall training needs. Not only their training needs, but their actual cybersecurity needs within the organization. So to really answer that question, we need to understand the tiers that exist. If you're a small company, you cannot get a cybersecurity expert that can do everything. There's just too much. In fact, it takes too much out of your operating expenses. So you're typically going to contract some component of it out. So really your cybersecurity awareness needs to be that of your organization, your actual participants there, and you need to have the security practices there within your organization to minimize the need for external dependency, just period. The second tier is when you start to get into medium. Now you can actually start to, as a medium-sized company, you can afford to have individuals. But the problem is, what sort of individuals do you get? And that's where we start to see the gaps right away, is that you have, depending on your company, needs for IT, and you have needs also in your product. You have needs for your customers as well, how you deliver those. And you want to minimize the costs, as would any business. So now you run into the gaps of how do I stay up to date with all the threats that are coming in? And how do I deliver and make sure that they're enacted and the policy is enacted internally? And so we do see the gaps of individuals who need to understand that. Typically, you could go through some sort of training program, but to get the experience and then keep up with that is also problematic. It's not a static target that you hit of, I know how to do this, and now security will never change. It is evolving on a day-to-day basis, in some industries, hour to hour, if not minute to minute. And then when you get into large enterprises, there you do have to have your own team in-house, but you need some top level folks there at, highly competent to take care of your team and various teams and interact and understand your organization as well. And getting those individuals is very difficult because once again, there's a gap in training, there's a gap in knowledge, there's a gap in staying up to date. And I'll say with security, timeliness, you cannot be waiting for something to happen. You have to stay ahead of the threat and you have to be prepared for when something happens. That planning, the acumen to develop that planning, to develop those processes comes with experience and with continual training and education. So I think I've kind of provided that intro there, Ali.
Now, if I go back to a session that I did probably about a week and a half ago, Tushar, you and I have been talking about engaging with folks that we sit on multiple boards with. For example, Luke Roy, the CIO from Laurentian University. And in my discussion with him, as you know, I run a show called the Power Hour. In my discussion with him, he mentioned something that really took to me. And this was this idea that digital transformation, or staying up to date, as you mentioned, with new technologies, new realities, new contexts, is not a challenge of finances. It's not a challenge of technical acumen. It's a challenge of culture. You've brought in your platform, Minute School, to start and to at least try and keep folks up to date and get them into a new culture of learning, a new culture of staying aware and up to date. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what is this new culture that you're ushering in with not your learning management system, but a learning engagement system? Tushar?
Yeah, and I think that's a distinction there, is moving from management to an engagement system, because people are creatures of habit. And it provides comfort to have a schedule. It provides comfort to know something's going to happen. That's why we have defined work hours for most people. Ali, yourself is probably not one where you're always working.
There's always an exception that proves the rule, a wise person once said, Tushar.
So I'm pretty sure I didn't say that, which also means I'm not that wise person or wise at all. But moving on to that scheduling capability, just having classes when you're in higher education provides that scheduling. When you move into the workforce, you have a set block of time, but within that block of time, there's moving targets. You may have meetings at different times. To block some time out for learning is increasingly difficult, if not impossible, in the modern workforce. In fact, putting in a block time is considered almost a waste of effort at that time. And people may use that to do other activities. Regularly, meetings run over. Regularly, you have fires to put out. So learning management systems fall down in this case because they're expecting the student to be motivated to come and do the learning. Even sending them a notification doesn't work. We know this. We know that almost like most notifications on a mobile device are ignored because they're drowned out in a sea of social media notifications.
Yep.
And if the listeners are and viewers are watching, you can just look at your phone right now and probably see that you've gotten 5 or 6 social media notifications right now. How's learning?
In my case, all of them telling me Tushar's online, watch Tushar live. Twitter's going off, Instagram's going off, Facebook's going, everything's going off.
I'm glad that I'm incredibly popular there, Ali, and I think I will have to have a chat about how you becoming my hype person in the future when I go on tour.
Well, I've created taglines for Minute School as well. I'll be dropping them. Don't you worry.
Much appreciated. So coming back to the topic here, you have to find a way to engage people. You cannot just expect them to find water themselves. Like, you can still lead them to water, but they're not going to drink it. Same sort of thing applies in this case, is that you're expecting them to go and say, okay, I'm going to go and learn now. That's not going to happen. Things are going to fall off. So what we're doing is that we're looking at new methods of engagement on how do we actually put this learning in a scheduled manner with as low friction as possible directly in that person's hands. And that means that you can't really push an app anymore. You can't say, go and log into this website. You have to make it arrive where they are. And that means you have to examine ways that they communicate. And honestly, the most universal way we've found that people will communicate and we can get into people's hands is their email inbox. And it sounds archaic, but that's where you go. So if we can put that learning right there on a scheduled basis, and we work with companies to do this, is on a on-demand or on a scheduled basis, putting it there, it allows you to open up new avenues of engagement and just-in-time engagement, which is extremely important in the cybersecurity world. Because now you can also start to say, we've had a 0 day, or we need to get this training out immediately, send it to their inbox. And it's there. Now, the second piece of that is, how do you measure? And for that, you still need to go to the platform, but that's just a button in an email. And that's how you actually measure the engagement. So it's not, and I think, if you've heard me previously on any of these talks, we've always said that fundamentally you have to assess learning because you need that retrieval process. So by having that in a very simple manner, and it's taken us time to iterate to get to that point, we have this mechanism where you can engage and you don't need to wait for people to be self-motivated to engage.
I want to just work with this a little bit and flip the script just a touch. Now, I know a lot of folks from Durham College, especially my students from our consulting course. So we have a dedicated AI and consulting course, which deals in situations just like this, are probably listening to this session right now. And one of the things that I often talk to them is to think about the Netflix and Blockbuster moment, right? And we all know very well about Blockbuster having the opportunity to buy Netflix, but not necessarily thinking that it was an opportune investment at the time. In your perspective, you're reshaping the way in which we provide content to cybersecurity practitioners live, reshaping the way in which we measure engagement. Is there a need to also realize how important content and curriculum development is? Because at the end of the day, you're all working with content. It does come down to how you distribute it. But even content itself does require a lot of effort from your side. How are you navigating taking large chunks of information? You mentioned zero-day attacks, taking large chunks of information and putting them into minute-sized bytes that you can distribute across your platform. Tushar?
Yeah, so also on this side, I'm just going to start with a comment. If you're chatting with your students about Blockbuster, Netflix, are they old enough to know what a Blockbuster is? I think maybe you need to update that.
Not everybody's as young as you, Tushar, but you know what? They do
you.
remember. Not everybody's as young as you. You know, they do fall in the age-old category of myself. So yes, they do know Blockbuster.
So, but let's jump into that. And that very model there is that when you even went from VHS to DVDs, you had the ability to actually go to chapters and jump around. That's a big move, right? And that's the sort of way that you should look at content as well, is rather than a continuous 1 hour session, 30-minute session, even 20-minute videos, which are too long for steady consumption and concentration to be held for 20 straight minutes and do learning during that time period, can you actually find natural topics within that content stream, let's call it? And can you actually go through and connect those to concepts that they need to learn, right? Or any sort of measurables that you can work along the way with. And so that's one of the first things we look at, is we've got this big chunk of content here. What are the actual individual objectives within the actual individual competencies that you're trying to actually assist a learner with? That could be a knowledge, skill, or an improvement or change in their attitude. And so if you can evaluate that material first as a course developer, a content developer, which is what we tend to do, can we actually break this down? The second thing is, before we even say, okay, how are we going to slice and dice this? We say, okay, we now know what the competencies are. How are we going to measure these competencies? And the measurement component is perhaps the most important. Too often, training material is just put out there with no assessment. How do you understand a student if they've consumed it? And how does a student even understand whether they've succeeded and spent their time well without having some sort of assessment? If at that point, all you're doing is taking learning, you might as well be watching a movie in the background or watching it in the background as a video, because you have no way of measuring that interaction of any output. So that's why for us, that measurement component is actually the most important component. And that measurement and assessment is not giving you a grade necessarily. It's not about that. It's just about, did you get what you were supposed to be getting out of this? And that in itself is a learning moment. You can have questions, you can have responses shaped such that they actually educate rather than simply assess. Simply measure.
Yeah.
And so we then go through and break it down into assessment. Then we come back to the material and say, okay, can we actually break this down? Can we form this in some way such that we can have natural assessment points throughout the actual material? And you can accumulate and culminate in an actual final assessment that can give a grade if need be. But by having natural moments of learning material, assessment, learning material, and so forth, you actually start to break this down into a manner that we most regularly learn. And this is how we naturally learn. And I'm not saying something here that is crazy new. This is part of what's been happening in learning and education. Is we call it micro learning, but really we're talking about micro assessment and continuous learning, which is less industrial in nature.
If you take that concept of industrial in nature and we think about the applications, at least in cybersecurity, or the different certifications that are out there, without pinpointing any specific one, you know the pathway that it goes through. And there's a question that's come down related to that, which is when you want to take a certain certification that has a title or that has some sort of a stamp attached to you, some sort of accreditation attached to you, you know the process. You buy an online module, you have books that you have to go through or chapters you have to go through, and then you go for a class. Is your environment also applicable to those kind of standard certifications? And are you seeing at all an interest from some of the behemoths of the certification world interested in looking at the model that you're proposing?
So I will say that, yes, our method and that course material content does adapt very well. We've yet to find material that doesn't adapt to continuous learning and engagement. And that's just because in classroom settings, think about, can an educator stop at any point and ask you a question? Could they stop every 2 or 3 minutes? And the answer is yes. There's almost no case, unless you're looking at a very large senior level mathematical proof that requires you to continue and in an unspoken manner, right, or unbroken stream of thought, and then at the end ask questions. That just doesn't occur, right? Like you can take checkpoints all along the way, and this is something that will need to happen because our lives are constantly being interrupted. I mean, how many times has your phone gone off in the last minute?
Again, just with notifications, are you watching Tushar? That's about it.
Oh, yes, thank you. So the reality is that even in a classroom environment, there are interruptions. In a work environment, there are interruptions. And that is how we have organized ourselves. We need to be looking at these new models. And are those companies, those instructors, those certification bodies looking at that? Yes, absolutely. Every single one is looking at it. And they're looking at how can we move our material into a simple, easy to consume manner, right? Like, and this, we aren't the only player in the space. We aren't the only ones working on it in the space. However, I think because of some of the things we're doing, we're perhaps the most visible. Now, have they come and spoken to us? Yes, universities have spoken to us about this. Community colleges have spoken to us about this, right? Like in all across North America. The reality is that it needs to be in this certification outcome-based environment. And I think cybersecurity training and certification models are more palatable to do this with rather than a 4-year, 3-year, 2-year degree, because those are very structured systems that are perhaps less likely to change and adapt over time versus something like cybersecurity training. The program you're going to have and material you're going to have next year needs to be different from, somewhat different from what you have this year as new models, operating systems are updated, things like that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've enjoyed about the approach that you've taken and having engaged with you over the last couple of months is that you have to embrace that uncertainty, that shifting terrain of the information that is required, the shifting context. The pandemic is a very good example of how completely remote work, then hybrid work, etc., has triggered new environments, new needs for training, new needs for standardization and testing. And I think the Minute School environment allows for some pretty interesting ways in which you can deliver content. So to those who are watching, if you are interested in taking a look at how the Minute School environment works with such information, contact Tushar directly. Also, in the next week and a half to 2 weeks, I know we just finished our approvals today. My team at the Center for Cyber will be working with Tushar's team on creating some new content for security frameworks, and you'll be able to see some of this content in action within the Minute School environment. So stay tuned and keep your questions coming. I see a few more that have been sent in, so keep them coming and I'll stitch them into the conversation as we go along. So Tushar, you've painted this interesting picture around learning, retrieval, how do you engage, going back to the dynamics of email, looking at content that exists in cybersecurity, the shifting landscapes, etc. I want to take the conversation a little bit now into the AI realm of things, because every situation, every subject matter has a different approach to it, and you've developed those kind of solutions. I believe you have a dedicated individual that deals with content development as well, and subject matter experts within that as well, which is an interesting model. But let's look at the AI applications to learning. Can you help our audience understand how you've taken certain principles and methodologies in AI and infused them into the Minute School environment? What's the return on this? What are you trying to achieve? Tushar?
Well, let's start with that last part. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to improve outcomes, right? And so that's, and as I spoke about earlier, that happens through measurement. So when we're looking at AI, we need data to operate upon. And so by being primarily focused on measurement and putting that up front, we now have data we can operate on. Whereas if you're looking at a purely consumption-based environment, that becomes very difficult to do, because what is the AI trying to do? Is it trying to increase consumption, right? And if all you're trying to do is do that, then you're going to fill people's learning feeds, or you've probably seen this on your YouTube feed, of things that make you just want to click on the next, and keep watching. Right. Whereas when we're talking about learning, we want better outcomes for the student. So if we have measurement involved, we now have the data to say, we did this, we measured them, this was our outcome. And we also don't want to look at immediate outcomes. We also want to look at long-term outcomes. So I'm just providing a little bit of refresher, perhaps for those of you who've been on previously, but for those that are new, if you are taught something today, tomorrow you will have forgotten 50% of it, right? And if you came back 30 days from now, you would have retained only 2% of it. So in the interim period, how do you make sure that you retain? And this is that retrieval piece I keep talking about. You need to refresh people. Otherwise, your brain's just going to be like, hey, you taught me something and I never used it. I don't think it's important. That's just our brain's work. So it's going to throw it away. So we have to look at how do we keep that fresh in people's minds, because this goes to those outcomes. In cybersecurity, that's particularly important, because practices, models and practices, people might need to learn something that they encounter once a week, once a month, something like that, that something flags and they say, oh, maybe I should behave differently when I do this. And so the question now is, well, what do you keep fresh in people's minds, and how do you keep it fresh? And this is where AI can really help from an augmentation perspective. And if we look at the line of where AI exists in education, you can look at one end of the spectrum being none. There is no AI machine learning whatsoever. The other end of the spectrum is the materials entirely generated by AI machine learning. And no matter what anyone says, we're not there. We're not close to that. So if we look at that middle space, that's where you start to have AI machine learning, where you can have material that's created, say, for example, in bite-sized manner, that's presented at particular times. So if you look at AI machine learning as a method to augment, now I look at it and say, okay, I need to, one, identify what we're going to teach someone today, what we're going to also assess them on, because we need information, and then we need to present them with something that'll improve their outcomes. So what we do, and we have a model for, is essentially measuring where you are right now, and based on your organizational needs, determining where you should be or the organization should be, and then keeping that at that specific level, that knowledge, skill, or attitude at that particular level for the organization or individual. And by now not following a straightforward, prescribed, large chunk, immovable, program, which is what in-person sessions are or large courses are. You can't customize them, you can't change the paths through them. But by having these smaller chunks, you can present just that specific concept that you need to at that particular time on a scheduled manner. 9 a.m. every single day, and at 12 every single day, measure, present, quick little bit in their email or on the platform, and then move from there. So what we really do with our AI machine learning systems is continually measure, develop a model for what the competencies look like for a particular individual, and then present the material that will best help them at that time.
I think you're referencing one of the important elements around AI, which it's not necessarily meant to replace the instructor in the classroom, but to support. But I do want to unpack that just a little bit more, because I see that there are two lines of thought here. You've mentioned about using AI, not necessarily to generate the entire content set that you're putting out there, although that is an option. You're using AI to understand that retrieval process, that learning process, and to develop, for lack of a better word, a pattern of life for each particular learner. Are teachers or instructors, are they also using Minute School and advantaging from such analytics? How is that relationship playing out? How are you seeing Minute School being used in an in-person environment for a faculty member like myself? And are you seeing any particular interesting trends in that area?
Yeah, I'll answer that question and ask some questions along the way, but then I'll answer them as well. So Ali, as an instructor, if you are in a classroom, what would you want to know about your students right now?
Well, for me, the first thing is that especially if it is a question of timing, but really week one, day one, I really want to know what their level is at very, very quickly. And I'll give you some context to that, since you've opened the door for me to open my mouth and provide my 2 rupees, which I do anyways. But given the situation that I teach in, let's take the Durham College scenario at the graduate level program, the graduate diploma in AI as an example, and when I run the introduction to AI studies. It's important for me to know, although it's difficult for me to gauge, especially online, to know what the background information is that these students are coming in with. And if I know at the get-go that one student is very strong on the DevOps side, another is very strong on the math side, it allows me to culture my content accordingly and create for more livelier discussion, because that's at the heart of that course. So to answer your question, that is what I'd love to know day one, week one.
And when you're moving along, you'd want to have continuous assessment as well, such that each session you're having, you can address to a system. And I can't take credit for this, and I don't think anyone can really take credit for this, but at University of Waterloo, when I built that first online learning environment about 2 decades ago.
When you were like 3 years old, yes, go on.
4 years old, about that. Okay. That's at that time, they had a flipped learning model. And flipped learning models, you can go and search them up, quite well known now, but at that time it was relatively new. Yeah. But the idea was, can we have the students interact with the material before they come to class? And now we can actually have discussion in class. And this was at the undergrad level. And the idea was, can the students go through and do what they would normally be doing in self-study time and simply prepare for the next class, measure that, and then actually have the conversation in the classroom. So I think that's a key piece there that I would say from a faculty perspective that they're interested in, is if the educator is motivated, they would like to know where their class stands and what they should address. Because then they move from simply being a person who is essentially duplicating content and talking through content to addressing problems that the students are having and doing it in a way where they can use their expertise to develop a learning model and improve the learning model that the student has in their mind of a particular concept, to actually get them to a point of competence. Because if you look at how our assessment typically is done, is we don't have a chance to really come back and address gaps.
Yeah.
And if you were able to just shift by one assessment, just one assessment, is that, can I actually take our assessment and our learning material, and rather than doing it after the content, do it before the content? Now, all of a sudden, that classroom experience is about addressing gaps, is about facilitating conversation and addressing real need, rather than just delivery and assessment and continuous delivery without ever coming back and assessing again. Right?
Taking a question that's come in from one of my students, Komal, good to see that you're online, and to all of my students as well. This is bleeding very well into some of the discussions that we had even in the AI and consulting course that just culminated a couple of days ago, which is this aspect of how much is actually being automated here. From what I'm hearing, Tushar, is you're using AI to a point where you're not using it to drive decisions. You're basically using it to collect a lot of information and present it to the teacher, to the instructor, to take some action on it. Are any of these analytics, or any of these pieces of intelligence also shared with the learners themselves, or is it locked to the instructor environment?
So that's a good question. So we operate in both manners. So right from the first talk I had in 2018 and really beyond, I've always looked at AI, machine learning, to essentially augment, not replace outright. That may mean that we have fewer people participating with particular individuals or delivering a particular service, but how can we augment people? So that say that if we have 1,000 instructors today and we actually need 10,000, that we can augment the 1,000 to fulfill the need of the 10,000, right? Essentially to try and achieve that capability. So we're not taking away and removing people from the equation. But when you're looking at a student who is needing to do self-study and doesn't have access to that individual, that instructor, how do we help them? And at that point, we do have to have a level of automation in place that also provides that student with direction. So certainly we have the faculty-based model where we show reports at an aggregate, at a micro level, where are people achieving, where are they not achieving. But for a student, we have a self-study mechanism where you say, I've got these items that I need to study. And then in 1 to 15 minute segments, you can go through and essentially assess, learn, and then see the outcomes, and then get direction on where you need to focus, and then continually go through that process. The issue is that different audiences have different needs and different capabilities of also understanding. A report that you present to an instructor cannot be presented to a student, and vice versa, a report you present to a student cannot be presented to an instructor. So for each audience, we need to tailor that. So we can't simply say, yes, we show the same analytics. We do show the same data, but presented in a different manner to each audience.
Working with these algorithms that you've created to understand the relationship between one user and the content that they're being provided or the tests that they've been provided, I noticed that on the Minute School environment, especially for those who are probably going right now, downloading the app, just checking it out, some of the free resources that are available, there isn't a lot of socialness in that platform. So for example, I don't mean that as a criticism, because I feel like it's a strategic move. I didn't see an option where one learner can friend another learner and where you can actually have interactions with other learners and how they're engaging with the content. Is that absence of the social interaction piece strategic? Is it something that you're doing some more research on as you look to implement it? Can you help our audience understand the thought process and the dev cycle that you're going through right now?
Yes, so that is a product development question. And so early on, and the original model that we had gone in with was a social learning platform, is how can students actually help other students, and how can we use AI to identify the students that are the best for a best fit. That doesn't mean that you take a student who got 100% in a course or got all the questions correct. It's how do you identify the students who can best help other students?
Correct.
Within a social environment, that modeling that is extremely difficult, and it requires more data. So we do have certain environments that we deliver in that do have interactions between students, but that model is extremely difficult because we have to find the right environments that the conversation is organic and not marks based. And that was our difficulty we found early on, is that students would just go and interact, and the interactions would be extremely poor. And this happens in all learning environments right now in courses, is, oh, 10% of my grade is from participation, I will go participate. But the quality of participation is very difficult. We've been looking and evaluating this on how to do it. Now, we have found other companies out there that are making advances on that, and we're learning from them. And then we will get to a point where we will reintroduce it, if need be, in a manner that is much more social. We do already have in the product this concentric circle or concentric environment model that when you sign up on the Minute School app proper, you pick your school. That is important because it sets your local environment. It allows you to have material that was created locally available to you. So there is that social element there already. And you can evaluate and peer review local material already. But if you can't find the help that you need there, we start to pull in your geographic region and more. And that becomes important in places like the US, where you have university systems, like, for example, if you're in Texas or California or New York State. The issue is that you're not just dealing with one university. That course may exist across 16 universities or 20 universities. And you still need to have local, but that course material is still be delivered in very much the same manner in a cluster that might be geographically disparate, but it still has many of the same interactions. So we're collecting information and data right now to improve upon that feature. The other thing is strategically, Minute School is about getting you help and getting you out of the app, whereas social media apps are about making you stick around. So I am just very cautious about making you spend more time doing this than you need to.
If we talk a little bit more about the algorithms, Tushar, there's the prediction element to it, there's forecasting elements, there are patterns that you're looking for. Now, if I try to think about the human side of it, and I note I didn't say human intelligence, I just said the human side of it because I'm looking from my perspective. There are questions about me being intelligent or not, so we will not go down that path, especially to my students. I haven't yet submitted your grade, so be very careful what you ask. But with that said, when I think about how I assess what a student is doing while they're engaging with content, I do look at patterns. I look at repetition. I look at certain words that they're repeatedly using. I look at the mistakes that they're making. How do you, when you're building your algorithm to make it what to focus on, how have you gone about doing that? There's a technical element of this, and there are technical libraries that you can use to deploy and technical concepts, statistical concepts that you can utilize. But at the same time, you've got to pick and choose what features and what attributes are you going to start paying attention to. Without letting the cat out of the bag and without sort of revealing your secret sauce, how do you make those decisions on what to focus on, especially when developing a learning product driven by AI?
Okay, so that starts to get into some interesting questions here about our platform, and I'll navigate around them. So I can share that a lot of the modeling we do on a student is based on an RNN, and it is large, and it is particularly difficult because of how our courses are organized around competencies. If you're in a typical course, you might be saying, what grade did you get at the end? That's what we're going to measure. We don't have that. We have essentially, some courses can have, 100, at least 100 concepts in them. Other courses might have more in them. You can have courses that are 2 courses that combine and overlap to some degree. So you end up with some very interesting problems on how do you build RNNs that can be trained in real time and even have simplified models off of that. So we use an approximation of an RNN. That's the best way to put it, because we do have an RNN model. We've had that reviewed and it does work, but an approximation is also faster and from a real-time perspective works just as well, because as much as you're evaluating a student, there is a margin there of you not getting everything perfect, right? And educators try and work to get that as perfect as possible. What we're trying to do is trying to present as best the material that we can and have them interact with the best material. We're not assigning a grade from our end, so our evaluation is a little bit different. We have a number of different algorithms as well that we use throughout the process. So you not only have evaluation, but then you have to say, okay, from this pool, what are we going to show? And how do you make sure that they're not tired of seeing the same thing again and again? We also have dynamic questions that can be generated. So that plays a part in keeping things fresh in students' minds. The evaluation piece, though, is one that we work on continually because we want to keep making that better. We want to get a better model. And for that, you need data. Yeah. And while it's easy and it might be saying, hey, based on my own understanding as an educator or your understanding as an educator, these are the list of items I look at. When you're operating in a digital environment, just gather it all, right? 20 years ago, data was expensive. Today, data is extremely inexpensive. And I had these conversations with some of your students there where they'll say, okay, we need to set up a database. And this might be like a gigabyte of data that you need to do. And I was like, okay, it's like a gigabyte. It's tiny. Just do it. It might take up some hard drive space, absolutely, of what you have. But we're dealing with data now where terabytes of data don't bother me, right? Like we have one of our data clusters that we have has 90 terabytes in it of data sitting there. And we work and
Tushar,
evaluate that.
that is your collection of Bollywood music and all of your
I
analysis
mean, come on.
of music going into the past. I mean, the audience
Don't
needs to
knock
know your
my
multiple
music taste.
skills. Fair enough. Yes.
But I think, I mean, to your point, is data is like, I really have to emphasize this as people get concerned about, oh, are we gathering too much data? You need to be at the early stages gathering that data, and then you need to be working and analyzing that to find what attributes, what do you actually care about? And you use different processes, different algorithms to do that. But it's part of it's just one step in the pipeline. And I think, Ali, you have this diagram that you use, which shows that data pipeline and how you use it. The AI is only one component of it. And you have all this data that's coming in from your product, and you have all these results that are being then used by your product. You still need to build the product around it. And you can keep swapping that model in and out and changing to different models if you need to find what fits best. 9 times out of 10, there's going to be a handful of models that will all work in there. And after that, kind of trying to flip between them to do that perfect optimization, it's not going to matter outside of perhaps financial markets and life safety markets, right? Those are about the only two where that will then matter. But I'd say, get your data in. Don't worry about what data.
Yeah. And I think this is something that, again, for all the audience members listening is, we often talk about the noise in the data, and we often talk about the cleaning process, etc. And that is part of that entire process. Going back to that diagram that Tushar is talking to, which actually I borrowed from him, which talks about that whole process of sanitizing and cleaning the data and then going through that process of testing. That's the larger picture. The AI components is just one part of it. Speaking about the AI components, Tushar, one of the questions that has come in is around the concept of clustering. And is there anything that you've done to sort of think about how can we take users and also group them into different batches of learning? And again, if I draw from my own experience, right now, when I teach the AI and consulting course, I will, by week 2 or week 3, kind of know which student is more inclined to the statistical analysis of the ROI on AI, who's more inclined towards explaining the back end, the DevOps environment, who's more on the deployment side. I develop these little clusters and try to work to their strengths, because their final presentation to me is basically pitching to me a project that they've won the RFP for, and now simply are doing their final presentation. But I cluster them into groups and create their teams in accordance to that. Does your platform do any of this clustering, and do you help create a pattern or a group of users?
So we can, and that's because of those competencies, right? And so we have competencies, behaviors that feed into them that allow us to go through and identify what the competencies of a student are relatively quickly. And you can, as an educator, and I'll say this, Ali, you can likely look at a student in the first few weeks and say, okay, in the remaining 10 sessions, this is where they're going to need help, because you see those patterns immediately. And that's that experience you have with that course. That's the data that you've gone in, that's gone to your brain, that is presumably producing a result based on your experience, and not just a mix of music and movies and other things like that, But the reality is that you are working off of data as a person there. And the same way you can discover those clusters, and you have to do that through that measurement of competencies. Once we have that, we are able to present that to educators. And honestly, our product, what it does is it goes through and tries to address those gaps by saying, here's material you need to learn, especially in a corporate environment. In a non-corporate environment, when you present it, or in an educator-led environment, you have to present that information and allow the educator to discover it and go through and see, I've got this set of students who are strong in these competencies, this set of students who are weak in these competencies. That is a natural clustering process that occurs. And it is just natural in our environment from what we have. Clustering itself on a larger scale also is interesting, because content itself tends to cluster. Yep. And that allows you to create micro courses, micro learning at the same time. So that's an important evaluation aspect as well. It's not only the students that cluster, it's also the content that cluster. And then there's a second piece there then that becomes important as part of your delivery process. Are you delivering one cluster before another of material? And if you are you actually having students that are losing out based on that they may be poorly performing in a particular area because they needed to review or be taught another area before? So this is also part of the content evaluation process and delivery process that educators need to utilize, essentially.
Let's work with that a little bit more. And when you go back into the mindset, especially if you've got a faculty member teaching cybersecurity, and I know that there's so much that we need to unpack about how cybersecurity curriculum is delivered, and perhaps I'm thinking now, based on the kind of thoughts that you've triggered, a session with Minute School and a couple of other faculty members teaching cybersecurity would be pretty interesting. In fact, a back and forth Q&A would be quite interesting to see how they could imagine new models to deliver trainings and educational programs. We're all known to be, or at least as faculty, we're known to be enemies of the unknown. And what you're proposing, although you've put it very, very eloquently and very humbly as well, is a very revolutionary way to thinking about how we prepare for our classes and how we conduct that continuous learning process. You have the radical notion that the learning isn't about the 14 weeks of class and then that's it. We as faculty have the responsibility to create a continuous learning environment or a program for continuous learning. What's the resistance like? Have you faced any? And if you had to, on your hand, count at least the top 2 criticisms that you faced, would you be willing to share what those have been?
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't just this platform. Like, I've been selling and building platforms for 20 years. And so I've done it within institutions, done it externally, being acquired by institutions as well, from a product perspective and company perspective to brought in. There is always going to be resistance to change no matter what. In fact, why do you think we have so many Call of Duty games that are basically the exact same game repeated over the last however many times, or NHL and sports games? It's in every single environment that there's resistance to change. For higher education in particular, the reality is that in many institutions, educators are focused on research rather than teaching. And teaching, they want to get through and make it effective, but they also understand that changing the model can have repercussions, can actually mean that they're not as effective with the students. So change does come slowly, and we have to build up the material on our end. We have to educate the professors as well. We have to provide the appropriate support for professors so they can deliver the material. And in that environment, I think we need to plug in on a smaller scale. And so that's also the difficulty, is how do you take a platform that wants to do all the engagement and only have it do a little bit of the engagement in a course? So I think that a fit there in corporate, in higher ed, that's based around cybersecurity training is a good fit, because it's material that's already evolving and continually evolving. Whereas there's quite a bit of other course material that doesn't change. It is very static for years, if not decades. And those are difficult to change, but those are also the largest market courses. So from the educator perspective, almost every single one sees the value on it. It's how do you get them to actually do that? And it will happen. It will happen slowly, but it will happen. And the proof is we are still onboarding courses in a well-defined learning environment. So LMSs, 2 decades after LMSs were introduced, and the learning model for those LMSs has not changed in 2 decades. You take a look at your Blackboards, your D2Ls, your Moodles, they are basically the same as they were 20 years ago. And professors are still just coming on to those platforms. So learning and education will change slowly. That's just the nature of what it is. However, those who move forward and are able to take on a more adaptable manner will see some benefits from it. I think the primary drivers have to be the students, and they have to spend the time outside of class and when they're done school on education. And for that, Ali, I'll ask you, how much time do you spend every day just learning?
For me, if I have to be brutally honest with you, I will always set a dedicated amount of time where there's one subject for the week. Now, I have a pedagogy towards it, right? So for example, this week, I'm trying to understand a little bit more about some of the security issues that arise in an Azure environment. Okay. Now I've dedicated my week to understanding this. And what I'll do is either I have content that's available that I can digest, but 45 minutes a day I will dedicate uninterrupted to that. But that is my pedagogy towards it. So I can hand on heart say 45 minutes a day, I make sure that I'm learning or engaging with content that I've not engaged with before. And that for me is a bit of a learning process. But to your point, Tushar, is given the nature that students find themselves in, the environment that students find themselves in, having to, for example, work multiple jobs to pay off tuition, having to, especially with our international cohort, it's very difficult to find that for that dedicated 45 minutes. And I guess
It is.
that is where, the minute school environment has to wiggle in to become interoperable with that really, really noisy schedule that a lot of graduate level students or undergrad students are having to adopt to, and workers as well.
And this is difficult. And during school, when they're in their coursework, yes, I don't think they're going to find the time. And it's too much to ask for because you're already in learning. But once you're done that, yes, you're working one job, two jobs, you're trying to pay off, you're trying to find a steady position. If you're not learning and advancing at that time, you're falling behind. And the biggest thing is you have to find a time to carve out of social media or something else, or while you're on a walk, listen to something. I try and do 1 to 2 hours a day, but that's because of the fields that I'm in. They're moving so quickly. We have to be adapting. We have to be learning. And that's difficult. Whereas I'd say most people who we know probably spend maybe zero hours, 0 minutes a day doing any learning beyond. And all of a sudden, 10 years on, they find themselves unemployable.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And so this is the difficulty that I think faces the students, is that at some point you do have to be self-driven to actually engage and continually engage and develop a program and find these environments that will help you learn.
Absolutely. And Tushar, there's so much more that I wanted to unpack in the space of AI and security-based trainings. And we've got about 4 more minutes left. But I do promise you one takeaway, on all seriousness, is I think it'll be pretty interesting to have a couple of faculty members, let's say 3 of them, along with myself and you, having a discussion on how are you delivering this content now, and what if we flipped it in the minute school environment, and looking at some of the projects that you've done at Durham College to see what the applications of that could be. I also know that there are some folks watching from the Chambers of Commerce, and if you are interested in seeing how some of these learning environments can be used to lend value to your members and to provide training services, etc., please reach out directly to Tushar or reach out to me, and we'll be happy to give you a tour of what we've done with the Minute School team at Durham College. 4 more minutes left, and Tushar, 2 questions. One that is not necessarily AI based, but steeped in the DevOps language that you and I are well familiar with. Have you seen any different learning patterns in students between mobile application and just web-based? Tushar?
Yes. So mobile environments are much more likely to be interrupted, and the learning sessions are shorter.
Yeah.
You just can't have that. We also saw a change from desktop to mobile starting about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were delivering a large course at York University, and it was one of the first that we'd made enabled for mobile. And at the start of the course, 80% of this content consumption was being done on desktop and 20% on mobile. By the time that we finished up and checked out of that company, so 4 years later, it was 20% consumption on desktop, 80% on mobile. And we're seeing that because you can do short learning engagements on your mobile device. Now you have to make those meaningful as well. If you're looking at from a spectrum perspective, the more you go in higher education, corporate education, or defined that way, it's going to be more on mobile. If you start to get down into 4th year of a university or college, or 3rd or 4th year, that's typically going to be on desktop because it's more involved from a course content perspective. But as you start to do the first few years of undergrad, later ends of years of high school, it's more mobile. And then if you're starting to do things that are elementary, intermediate, and early on in high school, it's mostly tablet at that point. So there's a lot of different data out there and different consumption patterns. It does come down to content as well, though. Certain types of content just are better on mobile. cybersecurity training, almost all can be done on mobile unless you're doing an actual live exercise.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of research studies out there that you could read. I do invite you to take a look for those students that ask that question, take a look at some of the publications and journals that we subscribe to that really go deep into how certain platforms drive engagement, how certain interfaces drive what kind of engagement. I think one area, Tushar, which is growing quite a bit in the Durham region as well, is training for seniors, seniorpreneurs, becoming a pretty interesting concept as well, but also bringing seniors who are now beginning to consume a lot of services online, courtesy of the pandemic, getting more training in their hands, and their learning patterns, etc., can be quite different. So, Tushar, excellent answer. And again, keep your questions coming, folks. We will have more of these sessions. I'll take the last one, and then we'll come to a quick conclusion. And Tushar, this has to do with security trainings, and more on the basis that a lot of technical security training programs have an element of them which allows you to go into a sandbox environment or to go into a simulation of some sorts. And they test you on the basis of how you respond live within a particular sandbox or particular simulation. Is that something that the Minute School environment can integrate with or create in and of itself?
Yes. So this is kind of a timely question. So 2 years ago, the year before the pandemic, I was in Washington, D.C., delivering a session on how can you do large-scale training. And we're talking about like hundreds of thousands of people being trained at the same time and how do you do that in a standardized manner. So fortunately, there are standards out there. So there's an organization called IMS Global, which sets the LMS standards. And so there is something called XAPI. XAPI allows you to have data that goes in and out and have learning events, and they go into a learning record store. So we integrate both with LRSs as well as into third-party platforms. And honestly, everything's built around integration. So jumping over to a sandbox environment, evaluating that, getting the data out of it, and then connecting that to the actual concepts is extremely important, because then you can actually support the learner on what they failed in the sandbox. And so it is one of the pieces that we try and work on, is how can we integrate so that we can get the data out and then present the best possible learning outcome and help the student on the best possible learning outcome.
Thank you, Tushar. And you know what? I would definitely want to continue this conversation and continue on and on this, because there's a lot that we can unpack. But I certainly see that not only should we be reaching out to folks in the security space, the AI space, but also the folks that are managing some of the continuous learning programs, the professional development programs, to see how that engagement can be shifted by utilizing some of the work that we've done together. But more importantly, the message that I've taken away from you is really a lot of learning has to do with unlearning. And if you start to peel away from the philosophical layers of it and you start thinking about how I'm learning content today versus the same content, how would I learn it 10 years ago, a lot begins to unravel in terms of how attentive you are to the program. How are you taking your notes? A lot of that reflection, I think, as faculty members needs to be done. And I think the Minute School environment, I know the Minute School environment provides a pretty neat opportunity to test out some radical approaches to how learning takes place in the classroom. So Tushar, as always, we had quite a few viewers on. We will be doing more of this session. I want to thank you for your time. To our audience, I want to let you know that another session of Tech Talks DC will be announced very, very shortly. The next session will sort of be a culmination of the summer semester. Tushar has been a fundamental element of our summer semester, working on 2 projects with us, kicking off another 2. But in this session that we do on Tech Talks DC, we'll be meeting with some of our students and getting them to reflect on what was it like engaging with industry partners? What have they learned from that process, and how has this set them up for the upcoming fall semester? Wherever you are in Ontario or around the world, I ask you all to stay safe, stay healthy. And once again, Tushar Singh, thank you for, I believe this is the 4th time in this season that I've been on a show with you, and I know it's not going to be the last. Thank you as always, Tushar. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.